Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, your mass strike headquarters. Now, we are in New York City right now, on the line with Eric Draitser. He is one of those organic mass leaders who is emerging from this, despite the best efforts of creepy facilitators, foundation operatives, anarchists, the Situationist International, fake foundation-funded pasionarias, and others. And he's saying that there's a undercurrent of discontent and revolt against the facilitators. Well, as I say here, down with the facilitators. Kick out the facilitators, these mind benders, go to majority rule, and get some fighting demands. So continue, please, Eric.
Okay, so actually picking up on the point that you just made with regard to the international facilitators, I believe you've mentioned this in previous weeks. You have these accounts, these eyewitness accounts of these Spaniards coming out of Madrid from the Indignado movement who are come to New York to occupy Wall Street, sort of helping to establish the model, this consensus model, right? Now, I also have eyewitness accounts now of these same Spanish infiltrators have sort of moved away from the spotlight, but they're actually now still there, and they're flying under the radar. And the way they've done this is by taking refuge within the Spanish language working group. And this is the way for them to stay within the Occupy Wall Street movement, but outside of the spotlight. So they implant themselves within a purely Spanish language working group. And I think from there, they're able to, if not direct, at least to observe and to provide some kind of direction for whatever facilitators or whatever secret steering committee there might be. So these Spaniards...
One thing, in a later segment, I have a lady coming on from Spain. It's Pilar Bazelga, who has this interesting blog, Don't Die an Idiot, No Morir Idiota, and she's got a full account of how the Indignados were hijacked by facilitators, and she mentioned some names of these people. One in particular, there's an Italian woman named Mara ran the evening General Assembly in Madrid at the Puerta del Sol and was basically a complete saboteur of everything going on. So we're going to try to get it that way. If we could come up with some names of these Spanish infiltrators, we could feed them back to Pilar there in Spain.
Yes, and again, something we've talked about before, the difficulty in actually getting these names. It is very difficult. I've been down there many times, and yet I'm not able to come up with anything other than first names. And these first names that I am getting, this is from photographic evidence, right? So anyway, I want to move on to a couple more points in the time that I have remaining, and that is I apologize for the noise behind me. I'm sort of in a restaurant right now. So
go ahead. Okay.
We have some of these events that seem to not make any sense. I want to try to make sense of them. One of these events from this week was the March on the Homes of Millionaires here in Manhattan. Okay, the marches, some of these events, such as storming the Brooklyn Bridge and all these other seemingly mindless, idiotic ideas, these are coming from something called the Direct Action Committee, right? This Direct Action Committee are the ones who are organizing stunts, publicity stunts, right? And these publicity stunts, these are being done specifically to discredit the movement and to distract people away from what it is they're supposed to be doing. Okay, and this is tremendously important because if people are able to understand how these infiltrators are doing this, you can actually prevent it from happening. The Direct Action Committee is something that we need to be looking at further, and I'd like to come back next week and discuss it more. Now, the teach-in is something that we also want to point out. So I did a teach-in last night on counter-revolution and infiltration of movements throughout history. Now, we go back to 1917 in Russia and bring it all the way forward to the Arab Spring of today. Now, without going into the details of this, I just want to point out one thing. I had about, I would say, between 20 and 30 people who showed up. Now, all but two absolutely loved the presentation, said it was incredibly informative, and that they were able to walk away with a lot to think about. However, I also had two who became incredibly irritable, incredibly uncomfortable, and in fact belligerent. And I think that this is the behavior of agents, of infiltrators. And so one of the ways I think that people are going to be able to flush them out of this movement, is by talking about the tactics of counter-revolution, the tactics of infiltrating movements. Because as soon as you do that, all of a sudden their demeanor changes. They no longer seem to be, happy and joyful and positive, and they turn very negative, very aggressive, and oftentimes they tend to go away. I was just speaking about this with somebody else, right? The idea is if you can flush them out, they tend to go away. Because once their cover is blown, they can no longer actually achieve what it is that they're there for, and their purpose is defeated. And I think that this tactic is really how we're going to be able to do it. If you're able to flush them out, you can get rid of them. Now, one last point that I want to mention, and that is that the notion of the consensus model is dying. Okay, I think people who have been down there now realize that this is simply the path to failure. And so what's happening is a new model is emerging. And what I think you might see is whenever it does actually finally get cold here in New York City and the park becomes cleared and people go into their own little circles, you can have a real movement emerge out of this. The labor unions are there. The young people are there. All of the makings of a mass movement is there. You simply have to shed the infiltrators.
So get rid of this strangulating, this straitjacket, this Procrustean bed of this crazy method of the assemblies, the ideological consensus and the facilitators and the working groups. How about this? When you mentioned this Direct Action Committee, is that an outside organization that calls itself Direct Action Committee, or is that a subcommittee of the Occupy Wall Street?
This is a subcommittee implanted within the body of Occupy Wall Street, and this is exactly the point, because if they're the ones who are coordinating these stunts, then they are the ones who need to be removed. Because if you can get rid of this notion of these publicity stunts, I think they have another one planned for Saturday. They're marching to Times Square for some reason. I couldn't even explain to you. To go, I guess,
maybe the NASDAQ, right? Maybe they're going to tell you that the NASDAQ is at Times Square.
Right, or Chase Bank, or something along these lines. In other words, things that are irrelevant, they'll go after. But the actual things that you need to be going after, they leave them alone. And the idea is that if you represent the real institutions of power and you are an agent for those institutions, then you couldn't possibly be involved in organizing any kind of events against them. And so this is how you manipulate and subvert the movement. This is this is no different than somebody like an Alexander Parvus in the early 20th century, right?
Exactly. The movement.
Right. So if you infiltrate the leftists, right, if you infiltrate opposition movements and you can divert them, you can misdirect them, you can destroy the movements themselves. And this is what's happening here.
Did they go to Soros's house when they did this march?
Of course not. Of course not. And they also did not. And they also did not go to Bloomberg's house, right? Because they apparently seem to love Bloomberg for some reason, right? They did go to, I believe, Jamie Dimon's house, which, could be a good thing. But again, what is it exactly that you achieve by doing this? Nothing. The answer is nothing.
It's much better to talk about the Wall Street sales tax that everybody would support rather than this sort of vindictive, singling out individuals, the sort of French Revolution guillotine stuff, which obviously for many people is harder to accept. But the idea, 1% tax on Wall Street turnover, who can be against it?
Right, and of course, again, what you do see, though, is you see people who want to actually discuss these issues, but they're sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say shouted down, but it's definitely pushed aside. And the reason why is because there's this irrational fear of concrete demands. Right, this fear of concrete demands, and I think this emanates from this idea of consensus. Of course, you don't want consensus on real issues. There is consensus, and it exists on the Wall Street sales tax, on the amnesty on student debt, on the stop to all foreclosures, on the creation of union jobs. There is consensus on these things. They don't want it. If I could just mention for people to follow me on Twitter at Stop Imperialism, that's Stop Imperialism.
Okay. Maybe we want to set up a labor committee inside the Occupy Wall Street labor committee. There's a precedent. We'll see you next week, Eric. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.